In the distance, something large shifted in the darkness. A growl deep and menacing echoed through the quiet camp. The rush of movement came too fast to avoid. Hello everyone. Welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. The morning air in the Rockies had a crispness to it, the kind that makes every breath feel like a sharp, refreshing cleanse. I had driven up the winding mountain roads from Denver the day before, looking for a bit of solitude. The city was always buzzing with noise, deadlines, and the relentless grind. I needed space to breathe, space to think. The sound of the creek, the rustling of the trees, and the steady hum of my fishing reel were the only things I wanted to hear today. The sun was just starting to break through the trees when I arrived at my spot. A secluded bend in the stream, far enough from the main trail that I could enjoy the peace without the interruptions of hikers or other fishermen. The water, clear and cold, rushed over rocks, tumbling in a way that made it seem almost alive. I had been here a few times before, always during the early hours, when the world felt empty and the mountains still held a sense of mystery. I grabbed my fly rod from the back of my truck and made my way down to the water, the ground soft under my boots as I carefully navigated the edge of the creek. The banks here were steep, making it a bit treacherous to get to the good spots, but it was worth it. I'd fished here for years and never saw another soul, which was exactly how I liked it. Perfect day, I muttered to myself as I settled into a spot, the shadows of the trees still long from the morning. The weather was cold but not cold, and I could feel the promise of a great catch in the air. My fly tied neatly to the line, I cast it out into the stream. The rhythmic motion of the line slicing through the air and landing softly on the water was calming. I settled into a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from being alone in nature. It didn't take long before the peacefulness of the scene began to feel different. Subtle, but distinct. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something in the air shifted. The breeze, which had been gentle and constant, suddenly stilled. A strange quiet hung over the creek, and even the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves seemed to fade. I pulled in my line and glanced around, feeling an inexplicable weight settle on my chest. Maybe I'm just getting jumpy, I said aloud to myself, trying to dismiss the creeping sense of unease. Still, my gaze kept shifting to the thick trees that loomed just beyond the creek, the underbrush dense and untouched. The Rockies were home to all kinds of wildlife, deer, mountain lions, and bears, of course. The thought of a bear crossed my mind, but I brushed it off. Bears were rare in this part of the Rockies, especially during the early spring when they were still in their dens. Besides, I was far enough away from the main trails that I felt relatively safe. But then came the noise, a rustling, deeper and heavier than any wind through the trees could explain. It was coming from the brush just off to my right. My muscles tensed. I turned slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. My heart rate picked up as I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. The noise stopped, but the air felt heavier now, the kind of silence that puts your instincts on edge. Maybe it's just a deer, I muttered, trying to reassure myself. The thoughts of a bear lingered, but I quickly shoved them down. I had a healthy respect for the wilderness, but I wasn't about to let fear take hold. Still, I stood up, stepping back from the creek, my eyes never leaving the tree-line. There was another rustle, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining this. Something was there. My body instinctively went into alert mode. I glanced around, looking for a way to defend myself, though I knew there was nothing I could do if a bear decided to charge. I was on foot in the middle of nowhere, and a bear, especially a grizzly, was something I couldn't outsmart or outrun. That's when I saw it. A massive figure emerged from the underbrush. Its fur was dark, thick, and matted with the early morning dew, its size far larger than any deer I had ever seen. The creature's broad shoulders rippled with muscle, and its eyes locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. I froze. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to act. It was as if time slowed, each second stretching into eternity as I stared into the animal's gaze. The bear took another step forward. Its paws were huge, each one the size of a dinner plate, and its claws glinted in the weak morning light. It didn't seem scared. No, he was watching me, sizing me up, trying to decide if I was a threat or prey. I took an instinctual step back, my mind racing for a way out of this. But I knew there was no way out. "Pain!" I shouted, my voice hoarse from the panic rising in my chest. I tried to appear larger, to make noise, anything to scare it off. But the bear didn't flinch. It growled low in its throat, a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. "Go away." I tried again, taking another step back, but I was trapped. The creek was behind me, the steep banks making it impossible to move quickly without falling. I was cornered, and I knew it. The bear took another step toward me, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. My mind was racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Should I stand my ground? Should I try to run? My eyes flickered to my truck, parked a good distance away, but there was no way I could reach it in time. Suddenly, the bear charged. I didn't have time to react. The animal was on me in an instant, its massive weight slamming into my chest, knocking me to the ground. The force of the impact was like being hit by a freight train. I gasped for air as the bear's claws raked across my chest, a sharp, searing pain that seemed to tear through me. My hands scrambled for something, anything to defend myself, but it was no use. The bear was too strong, too fast. With every breath, the pain intensified, my chest heaving as the bear pressed down on me. I tried to scream, but only a strangled noise came out. The world around me spun, each second stretching longer than the last. All I could think was, "Sir, I'm going to die here, sir." Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the bear backed off. It stood there for a moment, looking down at me, as if weighing its next move. And then, as if it had decided I wasn't worth the trouble, it turned and lumbered back into the trees, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I lay there, gasping for air, my heart thundering in my chest, blood soaking through my shirt. My body shook, both from the shock and the cold that was setting in. Was I alive? I didn't know. The pain was overwhelming, but somehow I had survived. Jesus Christ, I whispered to myself, my voice hoarse. It was all I could manage. The world felt like it was spinning, and for a moment, I thought I was going to black out right there, alone, in the middle of nowhere. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I lay in the creek, the cold water soaking through my clothes, mixing with the blood pouring from my chest. Couldn't move, not at first. The shock was too overwhelming. My entire body felt like it was on fire. Every nerve alive was pain. I tried to lift my head, but the world tilted dangerously, the dizziness almost too much to bear. My vision blurred, and for a second, I wasn't sure if I was still in reality or trapped in some kind of nightmare. Was that really a bear? Had I really been attacked? Or was I hallucinating? But no, the burning pain in my chest was real. The jagged claw marks were real. I looked down at my shirt, which was torn open, exposing the deep, raw gashes across my torso. The blood was still flowing, warm and sticky, mixing with the creek water. The pain was so intense, so raw, that I couldn't think straight. My hands trembled as I tried to press them against the wounds, but the effort only seemed to make things worse. The blood kept coming, more than I thought my body could lose. I gasped, trying to take a deep breath, but every inhalation felt like it was ripping my insides apart. Panic surged through me. What do I do? What do I do? I blinked against the dizziness and tried to focus on something, anything, to pull myself out of this. The phone, I thought. I need to call for help. My hand fumbled in my pocket, feeling for my phone. It was there, thank God. But when I pulled it out, I saw that the screen was cracked, and the battery was barely alive. It was nearly dead, barely 10% left, and that wasn't enough to keep my hope alive. I couldn't remember exactly when I had last charged it. I muttered a curse under my breath, already feeling the weight of my isolation press down on me. "Come on," I whispered to the phone, my fingers shaking as I tried to swipe it open. My hands were slick with blood, and I could barely hold the thing steady. I needed to make the call. _911_. That was all that mattered now. The screen flickered to life just enough for me to tap in the emergency number. I waited as the phone rang, each second stretching into eternity. My chest was on fire, and every breath was harder to take than the last. The pain was overwhelming, but I clung to the thread of hope that help was coming. When the operator finally picked up, her voice was distant, almost disembodied. "911, what's your emergency?" I've been attacked," I gasped, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. "A bear. It attacked me. I'm in the Rockies. By a creek. I need help." The words came out in a rush, panic creeping into every syllable. The cold, the blood, the dizziness, everything was becoming too much. "Stay calm, sir," the operator said, her tone trying to be reassuring but failing to mask the tension beneath it. "Can you tell me your exact location?" I took a shallow breath, forcing myself to focus, even though my vision kept swimming in and out of focus. The world around me seemed to blur into a haze of green trees and shifting shadows. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, but the pain made everything feel surreal. I don't know," I stammered. "I'm off the main trail, by the creek. There's a bend, near some rocks." The operator remained calm, but I could hear the urgency in her voice now. "Can you see any landmarks? Any trail markers?" I can't." My chest tightened as I tried to form coherent thoughts, but the blood loss was making it harder and harder to think. "Please just send someone. Please." My words trailed off as I felt my body begin to shut down, the pain overwhelming my senses. I had no idea how long it took for the operator to respond. Seconds, minutes, hours? Time had become meaningless. My mind was swimming, each thought blurry and distant, like trying to focus on a dream that kept slipping through my fingers. "Help is on the way, sir," she said, her voice fading in and out as if I was hearing it underwater. "Stay on the line." But I couldn't stay on the line. My phone slipped from my hand, falling into the creek beside me, where it floated away, useless. I let my head fall back, resting against the rocks that lined the water's edge, my body growing colder by the second. My fingers weren't working anymore, and I couldn't move them. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't remember if I had even called for help, or if I was just imagining the whole thing. Then, in the haze of pain and exhaustion, I heard the helicopter. At first, it was a distant sound, a low thrum of blades cutting through the air, but it grew louder, closer. I forced my eyes open, squinting against the bright light above, but all I could make out was the dark shape of the helicopter coming into view. I don't know how long I'd been lying there, in and out of consciousness, but the sound of the helicopter's blades made me feel something other than pain for the first time in hours, relief. The helicopter hovered above me, sending gusts of wind that made my body feel like it was being pounded by waves. The noise was deafening, but at least it was something. The medic crew was lowering a stretcher, their voices distorted by the whirling wind. "Hold on," someone shouted, their voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "We've got you. Hang in there." I didn't have the strength to respond. All I could do was watch, helpless, as they descended towards me, their figures shadowed and indistinct against the sunlight. My body felt like it was made of lead, and the pain was unbearable. I could feel the blood draining from me, each thump of my heart a reminder of how fragile life was in that moment. "Let's go, let's go," The medic's voice was more urgent now. "Get him on the stretcher. We need to move fast." Somehow, they managed to lift me onto the stretcher, my body jostling painfully as they strapped me in. The pain in my chest was unbearable as they worked to stabilize me, their hands moving quickly and efficiently. They pumped something into my veins, but it barely made a dent in the agony. As the helicopter ascended, the Rockies stretched out beneath me, of vast, beautiful wilderness that had almost taken my life. I felt my eyelids growing heavy, the world around me slipping into darkness again, and just before I passed out, I heard the medic's voice one last time. "We're taking you to the hospital. Hang in there. You're going to be okay." But I didn't feel okay. My body was broken, my chest raw with the bear's claws, my mind fractured by the terror of the attack. I wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. As the helicopter flew off, I couldn't help but wonder, "Sir, would I ever be the same again?" Sir. The next few hours passed in a blur. Every time I opened my eyes, I was in a different place, surrounded by faces I didn't recognize. The sterile smell of the hospital, the soft beeping of machines, the white walls. All of it felt alien to me. I tried to focus, to make sense of the fractured moments in between, but it was like being in a fog. The pain was constant, throbbing, deep. Every movement sent sharp reminders that I had barely escaped death. The first thing I remember clearly after being loaded into the helicopter was the stark brightness of the hospital room. I could feel the cool, crisp sheets under me, and I could hear the low hum of a monitor beside my bed. I blinked a few times, trying to adjust to the light, but the pain in my chest was too intense to ignore. "You're awake," a voice said, breaking through the haze. I turned my head slowly, wincing as the movement stretched the skin around my chest. A nurse, a young woman with short blonde hair and a calm expression, stood beside the bed. Her smile was small but genuine. "You've been through a lot," she continued. "Do you remember what happened?" I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth felt dry, like I hadn't drunk anything in days. My throat was sore, likely from the screaming, and my chest ached every time I took a shallow breath. "Yeah," I rasped, my voice barely a whisper. "A bear, a grizzly, it attacked me." The memory hit me all at once. Seeing the bear's eyes locked onto mine, the force of its claws against my skin. I tried to sit up, but the effort only made me dizzy. The nurse noticed, gently placing a hand on my shoulder. "You need to rest," she said. "We've got you stabilized, but you're going to need time to heal." I nodded weakly, still struggling to make sense of it all. The pain was overwhelming, and I was barely processing the magnitude of what had happened. A bear attack. It was almost impossible to believe. "You're lucky to be alive," she added quietly, as if to herself. Then, more brightly, she said, "The doctor will be in to see you shortly. You're in good hands." I wasn't sure what good hands meant at that point. I felt like I was on the verge of falling apart, but I wasn't about to let anyone see that. Not yet. My mind was still reeling, the image of the bear's massive form flashing in front of my eyes whenever I closed them. I wanted to forget it, to pretend it never happened, but it was impossible. The nurse left, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and I sank back into the pillows, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't until the door opened again that I snapped out of my daze. Dr. Daniels walked in, tall and thin with a kind but no-nonsense expression on his face. He wore a white coat that looked too big for his frame, and a stethoscope hung around his neck. He approached my bed with a clipboard, his steps measured and deliberate. "Jake Dawson?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Yeah," I replied, my voice rough. "That's me." He gave me a quick, assessing look, his eyes flicking to the monitor beside me and then to my face. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got mauled by a bear," I said, the bitterness slipping out before I could stop it. Dr. Daniels raised an eyebrow, then cracked a small smile. "You might have," he said, glancing at the notes on his clipboard. The trauma to your chest is extensive. A few deep claw marks, some bruising and puncture wounds. You're fortunate that it wasn't worse. Worse? I repeated, incredulous. What could be worse than this? He shrugged slightly, looking at the wound on my chest with a detached professionalism. You were lucky the bear didn't get a more solid grip or go for your throat. These kinds of attacks can be fatal, Jake. You're alive because you fought it off. Or at least, it decided you weren't worth it. I took in the words, feeling the weight of them settle in my chest. My body was alive, but I didn't feel like I was living. Not with the constant ache. Not with the haunting memories of that bear's eyes. The bear had made a decision that had left me with nothing but scars and a lifetime of fear. Are you sure it was a grizzly? I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. It was big, huge. I'm not sure what else it could have been. Dr. Daniels nodded, his gaze thoughtful. A grizzly, definitely. The size, the aggression, it all adds up. Black bears can be dangerous too, but they tend to be more cautious around humans. Grizzlies, however, are territorial. If it felt threatened or hungry, it would have attacked. I nodded, processing the information. _territorial_. That word stuck with me. I hadn't thought about it like that, but now it made sense. That bear wasn't just attacking me for food. It was asserting its dominance, defending its space. Do you think it could come back? I asked, almost immediately regretting the question. The thought of facing that beast again was enough to send a chill through me. Dr. Daniels gave a reassuring smile. Not likely. Bears don't typically linger once they've made a strike, especially if they didn't finish the job. Besides, you were airlifted out of there. It's unlikely it'll follow you all the way here, but we'll have a ranger check the area just to be sure. I wasn't sure if his words comforted me or not. The idea that the bear could still be out there, roaming free, made me feel small, vulnerable, and helpless. I was supposed to be the one in control. I was supposed to be the one fishing in peace. But now I was the prey. How long until I can leave here? I asked, trying to change the subject. I wasn't ready to be in this hospital room anymore. Wasn't ready to sit in the sterile space with my thoughts. Dr. Daniels examined my chart. You'll need at least a few days for observation. We'll keep you under for a bit longer, just to make sure there's no internal bleeding or complications. Ishing again felt impossible. That part of me, the part that once felt so strong and in control, had been shattered. All that was left now were the scars, the physical reminder of an encounter I would never forget. My phone, which had been left behind at the creek, was now out of my mind. I was supposed to tell people what happened, call the rangers, talk to a reporter, whatever it took to let the world know what I'd faced. But I wasn't sure I cared anymore. I didn't want to relive it. I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened, how to make anyone believe that it was real. The reality was that, even if I told the story, no one could truly understand it. Not unless they had been there in the moment, feeling the terror, the helplessness, the raw power of the wild. I closed my eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on me, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to cry, silently, into the pillow, wishing I could escape the memories, even for a second. I was back in Denver, though it didn't feel like I was truly home. My apartment seemed foreign to me, like someone else's place. The walls were the same, the furniture was the same, but it didn't hold the comfort it once had. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of the things I used to enjoy, the things that seemed so trivial now. Fishing gear stacked up in the corner, waiting for the next weekend trip that I was no longer sure I'd ever take. I spent most of the first week in a haze. The painkillers helped dull the sharp edge of the agony, but they didn't touch the emotional scars. I barely slept, tossing and turning through the nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bear again. Those dark, malicious eyes locking with mine before everything went dark. The image haunted me, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep it together. I had hoped that the hospital would give me a clear path forward. Physical healing, a timeline, something. But all I'd gotten were instructions for wound care and a prescription for more painkillers. The doctors said I'd heal physically, but they didn't offer any advice on how to deal with what I was feeling. There was no manual for surviving a bear attack, no quick fix for the terror that still gripped my chest. I didn't talk much about what had happened, not to anyone. Friends and family tried reaching out, but I just didn't know how to explain. How could I tell them the truth? That I had been a split second away from being torn to pieces, that I still felt like that bear was lurking somewhere just outside my door? And that's when the calls started. The first one was from the local news station. They wanted an interview, asked if I'd be willing to talk about what had happened. I wasn't sure why they even thought it was newsworthy. It wasn't like I'd been a hero, fighting off the bear with my bare hands. No, it had been sheer luck that I wasn't dead. The bear had lost interest, or maybe it had decided I wasn't worth the effort. Either way, I didn't feel like I had a story to tell. I wasn't some survivor who'd overcome a great battle. I was just a guy who'd narrowly escaped death. I told them no, I wasn't interested in sharing the details. But then the second call came, this time from _Outdoor Adventures _, a small fishing magazine based out of Colorado Springs. They wanted to write about the attack, wanted my take on what happened. They said they'd been following bear sightings in the area and thought my story would add to the conversation. I didn't want to be part of some media circus, but something about it made sense. Maybe if I talked about it, told my side of the story, somehow I could make sense of the chaos in my head. So after much hesitation, I agreed. I met with the editor at a small cafe in downtown Denver. The place smelled like freshly brewed coffee, and the soft chatter of patrons created a dull background hum. It was strange, sitting there in the safety of the cafe, a place so far removed from the wilderness I'd almost lost my life in. The memories of the attack felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who wasn't me. Jake, right? The editor, a tall man in his early 40s, extended a hand as I walked in. His name was Doug, and he gave me a warm smile that seemed genuine enough, though I couldn't help but wonder how much of his interest was driven by the sensational nature of the story. That's me. I shook his hand, my grip weak but steady enough. I sat down across from him, careful not to move too quickly, still aware of the soreness that lingered in my chest. He pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open with practiced ease. I'm glad you agreed to meet. I've read your account, and I just want to give you the chance to tell the story the way you remember it. No fieldes, no exaggerations. Just what happened. I nodded, unsure of what I expected. Maybe some kind of relief in telling my side. But instead, I just felt exposed. It's not much of a story, I said, almost apologetically. I was out fishing, minding my business, and then, out of nowhere, this bear just appeared. Just like that, Doug asked, leaning forward. Yeah, I muttered. I didn't see it coming. There wasn't any warning. It just attacked. Was it a black bear? He asked, jotting something down in his notebook. Could have been mistaken for a grizzly, maybe? I shook my head, the memory still fresh. No, it was definitely a grizzly. Too big, too aggressive. I've seen black bears before, but this was different. It was like it was coming for me. Did you do anything to provoke it? Doug asked, and I froze. The question, while innocent enough, felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Did I provoke it? No, I said firmly, though I wasn't sure if I was convincing him or myself. I didn't do anything to provoke it. I was just fishing, sitting there. It came out of the brush, and before I could even react, it was on me. Doug paused, sensing the tension in my voice. You know, he began slowly, wildlife experts have said that grizzlies are often more aggressive in certain areas, especially around food sources. Could there have been anything that might have made the bear think you were a threat? I leaned back, feeling the weight of his question. I thought about the bag of snacks I'd left too close to the water, the faint scent of fish from earlier in the day. Could it have smelled that? Maybe. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The bear had attacked because it could, because that's what animals like that do when they feel threatened or hungry. And I had been caught in the crossfire. It didn't matter. I said quietly, my voice low. It just happened. Doug seemed to sense that the interview was starting to get uncomfortable, so he shifted gears. Okay. No need to dwell on that. So, after the attack, what happened next? How did you manage to survive? I recounted the few details I remembered. The struggle, the blood, the helicopter ride. I told him about the moment I'd thought I was going to die, how I had just waited for the end. But then, I told him about the pain, the exhaustion, and how, despite everything, I was still here. It wasn't much of a story, not in the way I think people wanted to hear it. I wasn't the hero. I didn't fight back with some great surge of strength. I just survived because I had no choice. Doug seemed satisfied with the interview, though I could tell he was itching to put his own spin on it. He thanked me several times, saying he'd keep in touch. But when I left the cafe, I felt no sense of relief. The story would go out into the world, but it wouldn't change what had happened to me. I didn't know what to feel anymore. The bear was still out there, somewhere, but it wasn't the animal I was worried about. It was the memory, the terror that would follow me no matter where I went. That evening, I sat in the silence of my apartment, staring at the walls, and I realized I wasn't just trying to move on. I was trying to forget. A week after the interview, the story hit the fishing magazine. It wasn't the front page feature I had imagined. Instead, it was buried somewhere in the middle. A few paragraphs about a local fisherman who survived a grizzly attack. The headline was sensational enough to grab attention. Surviving the grizzly. A fisherman's narrow escape. It was exactly what I'd expected. A brief mention of my name, a vague description of the attack, and then a few quotes from the interview. They hadn't gotten the details wrong, but it felt like they had missed the point. The bear hadn't been a headline for me. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. It wasn't about being a survivor or telling a story. It was about the terror that lingered, the fear that still wrapped its claws around my chest. But that wasn't something the magazine could sell. People wanted to hear about the heroic fight, the thrilling details, not the quiet aftermath of a man who was just trying to figure out how to move forward. I stared at the magazine, the glossy pages reflecting the harsh light of my kitchen, the pictures of the mountains, the river, and even the generic shot of a grizzly in the wild did nothing to comfort me. I didn't recognize the man in the story. It wasn't me. The words on the page felt hollow, like an echo of someone else's life. I slammed the magazine down on the counter and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the feeling that everything had gone sideways. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. I glanced at the screen and saw the name _dad_. I hesitated, then picked up. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to sound more normal than I felt. "Chink." His voice was low but warm. "I just read the article. You okay?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "Yeah, I'm fine." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I knew he was trying to figure out what that really meant. "Listen," he said carefully. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. That we're all worried about you. That's a hell of a thing you went through. It's okay to not be okay." I didn't answer right away. His words hung in the air like a weight. I wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. Was it the pain that was fading in my body? Or the constant noise in my head that wouldn't stop? Or was it the fact that, no matter how many times I tried to ignore it, the image of that bear kept flashing before my eyes? "I don't know what to do with all this," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I thought once I got out of the hospital, once I went home, things would go back to normal. But they haven't. It's like nothing fits anymore." There was another silence on the line, and then I heard the rustle of papers. "It's going to take time," Dad said softly. "You've got to let yourself heal, Jake. You've been through something that a lot of people can't even imagine." "Yeah, well, it doesn't feel like I'm healing," I muttered. "You're still processing," he said, his tone firm but kind. "Just give yourself time. And if you need help—" I know, I interrupted. "I've heard it 1,000 times already." He didn't seem offended. Sometimes we need to hear it more than once. It's not easy what you're going through, but we're all here for you, kid. Don't shut us out. Alright? I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't shutting anyone out. I was just stuck. The bear had changed something in me, something I wasn't sure I could get back. I had always thought of myself as a guy who could handle anything, whether it was a tough day at work or a tough fight with an old friend. But this was something different. This wasn't something you could fix by just toughing it out. It wasn't something you could walk away from without leaving a part of yourself behind. After a few more moments of silence, Dad said, "If you need to talk about it, we can do that. Just give me a call." "Okay? Okay," I replied quietly. We hung up, and I sat there, staring at the phone. For a second, I almost picked it up again, to call someone else, to reach out to someone, but I stopped myself. The truth was, I didn't want to talk about it anymore. I didn't want to rehash the bear attack or explain how I couldn't stop thinking about it. What good would it do? They wouldn't understand. Not really. The following day, the aftermath of the story hit me harder than I expected. A few of my buddies from the fishing community reached out, offering their support and sharing the article with me. Some sent messages of disbelief, others in awe of my survival. But then there were the others, the ones who didn't reach out. The ones who left me to stew in the silence. And the silence was the worst part. People didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to respond to someone who'd almost died at the hands of an animal. It wasn't like a car accident or a workplace injury. A bear attack was something too wild, too untamed, too far removed from their everyday experiences. So they just didn't talk to me. Couldn't blame them. I didn't have the words either. All I had were scars, both visible and invisible. One evening, I took a walk through the city, hoping the crisp air and the soft buzz of life around me would ground me in some way. But as I walked past the neon lights of the bars and the busy cafes, I couldn't help but feel like an outsider. I felt like everyone else was just living, just moving forward, while I was standing still, drowning in a memory I couldn't escape. I ended up at the river, the place where I'd once felt calm and at peace. It was quiet now, the water flowing gently under the darkened sky. But as I stood there, gazing out at the ripples, something stirred deep inside me. The river, the mountains, the wilderness, they all felt so far away now. I had left that world behind. The life I'd once had seemed out of reach, like it belonged to a different person altogether. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees behind me. I heard the familiar sound of a bird calling, but the noise didn't comfort me like it used to. Instead, it made me think of the bear, of the wilderness that was no longer a safe place. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Doug at _outdooradventures_. The magazine wanted to run a follow-up piece on me. A "Where Are They Now" story, he called it. It made sense, in a way. They wanted to keep the narrative going, keep the attention on the guy who'd survived the bear. But all I could think was, "I'm not your headline. I'm not your story. I deleted the message without responding. The truth was, I wasn't ready to tell anyone the real story yet. The real story was the one I was still living, the one that no one else could see. I didn't know how to move on, but I was starting to realize that maybe it didn't matter if I ever did. Some things you just carry with you forever. I couldn't tell if the nightmares were getting worse or if I was just too tired to fight them anymore. The pain in my chest had subsided, but the scars, physical and mental, were still there. They had become a permanent part of me, reminders of an event I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. Each time I closed my eyes, the memories came rushing back. The brush, the growl, the dark, gleaming eyes of the bear. I spent the next few days in a daze. I didn't leave the apartment much, and when I did, it was usually to run errands, to go through the motions. It wasn't that I was afraid of being outside. I was just numb. People moved around me like nothing had happened, and I hated them for it. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them how different everything felt, how _wrong the world seemed after the attack. But I didn't. I just kept my head down and kept moving. One evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table again, staring at the fishing magazine article. Doug had sent me a copy of the follow-up story. The headline now read, _the survivor. Jake Dawson's return to the water. It felt like a cruel joke. There was no return to the water. Not for me. I had left that world behind when the bear had decided to make me its prey. I skimmed the article, reading about how the brave fisherman was recovering, how he had managed to survive the attack and was now considering his next steps. The article painted a picture of triumph, of a man who'd survived something terrible and was now ready to go back to his life. But the truth was far from that. There was no return to the water. No, the fishing poles remained untouched in the corner of my apartment, gathering dust. The river I had once loved felt like a place of terror, not peace. I tossed the magazine aside and ran my fingers through my hair. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I should just get back out there. That's what everyone expected, right? But the thought of being anywhere near a body of water made my chest tighten, my breathing shallow. The thought of any grizzly, was enough to make me freeze. Just as I was about to reach for my phone to text Doug, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. With a sigh, I stood up and walked toward the door, glancing through the peephole before opening it. To my surprise, it was Officer Jenkins, the local sheriff's deputy who had helped with the investigation after the attack. "Schenk," he said, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk for a minute?" I stepped back to let him in. "Sure. Come on in." "Thanks," she muttered, entering the apartment. He took a moment to glance around before sitting down on the couch, his hands clasped in front of him. "I just wanted to check in on you. Make sure you're doing all right after everything." I sat across from him, unsure how to respond. "I'm getting by, I guess." He nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "Nuck, I know this whole thing has been difficult, but there's something I need to tell you. Something that's been bothering me." My stomach twisted. "What is it?" "I've been looking into the bear attack," he began, his voice steady. "And, well, we've had some complications with the investigation. The thing is, there's no way to prove the bear was the one who attacked you." I stared at him, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What do you mean? You were there. You saw the damage." He shifted uncomfortably. "The thing is, Jake, the bear didn't leave any clear tracks. No sign of a struggle. We did a sweep of the area, but we couldn't find anything concrete. No bear prints, no fur, nothing that would tie the attack directly to a bear. It's all circumstantial at this point." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "You're telling me you don't even know if it was a bear?" My voice cracked as the disbelief set in. Jenkins looked at me sympathetically. "I'm not saying it wasn't a bear, but without solid evidence, it's hard to make a definitive case. Bears are common in that area, but without a body or clear signs, we can't confirm it was the one that attacked you. All we have are your word and the injuries." I was silent for a long moment. The thought that I might not have even been attacked by a bear was almost worse than the attack itself. I felt like I was losing control over the one thing I had left. My own story. The story that was already being turned into a spectacle by the media, the one that was supposed to make sense of everything. "So, what does this mean?" I finally asked, my voice hollow. "Well, it means there's no case," he replied softly. "It means there won't be an official report. No charges against the bear. We're not going to pursue it any further." "I'm sorry, Jake, but that's the reality." The weight of his words settled on me like a heavy stone. What had I been fighting for all this time? If no one would even acknowledge what had happened to me, then what was the point of it all? "I guess I don't really have much choice then, do I?" I muttered, my anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. "Nuck, I know this isn't fair, but it's the way things are. There's nothing more I can do on my end. All I can say is you've got my support. If you ever need anything, just let me know." I nodded, but inside, I felt like I was unraveling. "Thanks, but I think I'll be all right." He stood up to leave and I followed him to the door. As he turned to walk down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the final nail in the coffin. The bear had won. Not in the physical sense, it hadn't killed me, but in every other sense, it had stripped me of my voice. I couldn't prove anything. The fear, the trauma, it was just my word against nothing. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, staring at the empty apartment. Felt like everything had come full circle. I'd survived, but I wasn't sure if I was supposed to feel like a hero or a victim. The scars on my body weren't enough. No one would ever understand the kind of terror I had faced. They would never know the true weight of the fear that still clung to me. I was left with only the memory of the attack, my personal ghost that would never fade. And as I stared out the window at the darkened city, I realized that there was no going back. The world had changed, and so had I. The bear had walked away that day, but I would never be able to. It had been nearly a month since the bear attack, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted in some fundamental way. I hadn't gone back to work yet. I hadn't even thought about it. Instead, I spent my days in a kind of limbo, trying to convince myself that everything was fine while the world around me moved on, leaving me behind. I told myself I would go back to the river eventually, that I'd face the fear and put it behind me. But every time I thought about it, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. The mornings were the worst. I would wake up, still tangled in the same sheets, my body stiff from a night spent tossing and turning. The remnants of the dream lingered in my mind, an endless chase through the trees, the sound of the bear's growl filling the air. Sometimes, I could still hear its breath in my ears, feel the ground tremble beneath its weight. I avoided looking at the fishing rod. It sat in the corner of the room, a symbol of something I could no longer touch. Every time I passed it, I felt a pang of guilt. Guilt for abandoning something that had once been a source of peace and joy. Guilt for being too weak to even pick it up. It was late one afternoon when I finally gave in. I couldn't stay holed up in the apartment forever. I had to get out, even if it was just for a walk. I didn't go far, just down to the park, where people sat on benches, talking and laughing, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I wasn't really there with them. I was somewhere else, stuck in a past I couldn't escape. I was sitting on a bench, staring out at the river that ran through the park, when I heard a voice. "Jake." I looked up, and there was Doug, the editor of _Outdoor Adventures magazine. His face was creased with concern, his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to figure something out. "Doug," I said, standing up to shake his hand. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied with a faint smile. "I thought you'd be out fishing by now." "Not quite ready for that," I muttered, looking down at my shoes. He nodded, taking a seat beside me. "I get it. It's been a hell of a ride for you, man." I didn't respond. I just stared at the river, watching the current move slowly downstream, just like my life felt. Drifting, going somewhere but with no clear direction. Doug cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what you said in the interview, you know? About how everything's changed for you. And I think maybe I can help. If you're up for it, we could take a trip out to the mountains again. Get you back to that spot, maybe get you some closure." I shook my head, the thought of returning to that place almost making my chest tighten. "I don't think that's a good idea, Doug. I don't think anything's going to change. I don't know how to move on from this." Doug didn't push. He just sat there quietly, his hands folded in his lap. "You don't have to move on all at once. Just take small steps. It's not about forgetting what happened, Jake. It's about finding a way to live with it. And sometimes the only way to do that is to face it head on." I didn't answer right away. His words made sense in a way. I had been avoiding the truth, telling myself that I could just walk away from it all. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The bear, the attack, the terror I felt, it had become a part of me, and I couldn't keep running from it. Finally, I sighed, my breath coming out in a rush. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." You won't know until you try, Doug said, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to do it alone. I'll be there with you. We'll take it slow. I looked at him for a long moment. Doug wasn't trying to rush me or make me feel like I had to be something I wasn't. He was just offering a chance to try. I wasn't sure if I was ready. But at that moment, I knew I couldn't keep living in the shadow of the attack. All right, I said finally, my voice steady but uncertain. Let's go. A few days later, Doug and I found ourselves standing at the edge of the same river, the same spot where the attack had happened. The forest around us was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was the same spot, but everything felt different. The air was thick with memories, and my body felt tense, as if I were waiting for something to happen. I had brought the fishing rod, but I wasn't sure what I was doing with it. I hadn't touched it since the attack, and now it felt foreign in my hands. Doug stood a few feet away, unpacking his gear and setting up, giving me space. You don't have to do anything, you know, Doug said without looking up. If you're not ready, that's fine. I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. I wasn't sure what I was looking for out here. I wasn't looking for redemption or some big moment of triumph. I just wanted to know if I could stand here again, if I could face the place where my life had changed forever. I took a deep breath and set the rod down on the ground. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the water. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the river. The light was fading, but I didn't move. How did you do it? I asked suddenly, my voice rough. Doug glanced over at me, confusion flickering in his eyes. Do what? How did you go back after everything? I gestured to the river. After the things you've seen, the things you've been through. How do you just keep going? Doug was silent for a long time, and for a moment, I wondered if he would answer at all. Finally, he looked at me, his expression serious. I didn't. Not at first, he said quietly. But one day, I realized that I couldn't let the fear control me. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about not letting it define me. I still carry it with me just like you will. But it doesn't own me. I looked down at the rod in my hands. The thought of letting the fear go, of not letting it control me, it was terrifying. But maybe it wasn't something I could outrun. Maybe it was something I had to face, something I had to live with. I nodded, slowly. I think I understand. We stood in silence for a while, the evening settling around us. The river flowed steadily, the water smooth and calm. It was the same river, but I felt different now. The fear wasn't gone, but I knew I wasn't as alone in it as I had felt before. Maybe that was the first step. Maybe, just maybe, I could start moving forward again. The days after that visit to the river were filled with strange clarity. There wasn't any grand revelation or some magical moment where I felt at peace again. There was no clean break, no closing of the chapter. But for the first time since the bear attacked me, I didn't feel the weight of it on my shoulders every waking moment. I felt lighter in a way. The fear didn't completely disappear, but it had lost its hold on me. I wasn't looking over my shoulder all the time anymore. Still, it wasn't enough. Something was missing, like I was walking around with a hole in my chest where the certainty once lived. The idea of returning to my normal life seemed more and more distant every day. How could I go back to being the guy I was before the bear, before the attack, before I learned how fragile everything was? I wasn't sure what I was trying to prove by going back to work or fishing again, but I knew I wasn't quite there yet. So, I stayed in my apartment for a few more weeks, working on little projects around the place, trying to fill the void. Some days were better than others, but I knew I wasn't ready to face the world again. Not without the nagging memory of the bear lurking in the back of my mind. That's when I got the call. It was early in the morning, the sunlight already pouring through the blinds, painting my kitchen floor in pale golden stripes. Jake. The voice on the other end was Doug's. Yeah, what's up? I need you to come down to the station. There's something we need to talk about. I frowned. What happened? Is this about the bear? Yeah, Doug said, his voice grim. There's something you should know. It's about what happened to you. I felt the knot tighten in my stomach. I hadn't heard anything about the bear since the initial report and the conversations with the sheriff. So what was Doug calling about now? What had changed? I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived at the station, Doug was waiting for me outside, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. Come on, he said, leading me to a small conference room in the back of the station. He closed the door behind us and sat down across from me. I sat down, still unsure of what was going on. Doug took a deep breath before speaking. I don't know how to say this, Jake. I thought you should hear it from me. Just tell me, I said, bracing myself. We found the bear, Doug said quietly. The one that attacked you. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I waited for him to continue. We were following up on some reports from other areas, Doug went on. There had been sightings of a large grizzly moving through the same parts of the Rockies, so we started to track it. And sure enough, a few days ago, we found its den. We did a sweep, and it was the same bear you described, the one that attacked you. How do you know for sure? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It's the scars, Doug replied. We found a trail of fur near the den, and after some testing, we confirmed it was from the same bear that attacked you. And the damage to the bear's paws, claw marks, it matches what you told us happened to you. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the information. The bear wasn't some shadow, some unknown creature that had terrorized me in the wilderness. It was real, and it had been found. What does this mean? I asked, my voice hoarse. Is it over? Is the bear taken care of? Doug shook his head slowly. Not exactly. We've been tracking it, but it's still out there. The thing is, this bear wasn't acting out of the ordinary. It was just hungry. The attacks, yours included, were just the result of it being in close proximity to humans. I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. So it wasn't some rogue bear? Just a hungry animal? Doug nodded. Yeah, exactly. It wasn't personal. It wasn't hunting you. It just saw you and you were in its path. And that's the reality of living in bear country. Sometimes, humans and animals cross paths, and it doesn't always end well. The weight of it all settled on me, and I suddenly felt tired. So that's it? No big moral here? Just a bear doing what bears do. Doug didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at me for a long time, like he was trying to figure out what I needed to hear. Finally, he spoke. I'm not going to lie to you, Jake. That bear was dangerous, and what happened to you was bad. But it wasn't personal. It didn't set out to hurt you. It wasn't like some hunting predator. It was just acting on instinct. I let out a slow breath. I guess that makes sense. You don't have to like it, Doug said, his voice soft. But that's the truth. And sometimes the hardest part is accepting that there was no reason, no grand plan behind it. It just happened. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully understood. The whole thing still felt surreal. The attack, the bear's behavior. It was all still so foreign, so removed from anything I'd ever expected. I had imagined so many scenarios, so many ways the bear could have been an anomaly, some outlier acting out of some unexplainable rage. But no, it was just an animal following its instincts, a force of nature indifferent to me, to my survival, to anything that I thought mattered. So what happens now? I asked, my voice small. We're keeping an eye on it, Doug said. If it comes back into populated areas, we'll have to deal with it. But for now, we're going to leave it alone. It's doing what it does. But you've got your story now, Jake. You're not just some victim. You're someone who survived a bear attack. It didn't feel like survival. It felt like a fluke, like I'd been lucky to walk away with my life. And yet, in a strange way, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just a victim. I was a survivor. But the bear wasn't the only thing I had to reckon with. I had to reckon with the fear that still clung to me, the doubt, the uncertainty about whether I could truly move forward. Yeah, I said softly, my eyes on the table. I guess I am. Doug stood up. If you ever want to talk, or if you need anything, you know where to find me. Aston too, offering a half smile. Thanks, Doug. As I walked out of the station and into the bright sunlight, I felt the heaviness lift just a little. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know if I'd ever truly be free of the fear. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could keep moving forward. The bear had walked away, and now it was my turn. The weeks following my encounter with the bear felt like a slow unraveling. The fear that had once gripped me in tight, unrelenting fists had loosened its hold, but it hadn't vanished entirely. It lingered in the background, a shadow that I couldn't quite escape. Each day felt like I was treading water, trying to find my balance again, but never quite sure of the next step. I didn't go back to the mountains. I didn't even want to. Not yet. There were days when I could almost convince myself that I had moved on, that the worst was behind me. But the memory of the bear's eyes, the weight of its presence, would rear up like some dark phantom, and I'd be back to where I started, staring into the abyss. But it wasn't just the bear that haunted me. It was the feeling of having lost something fundamental. There was a quiet isolation that had settled around me, something I hadn't expected. A gap had opened between me and the world I once knew. People who used to feel like old friends now seemed distant, like they were speaking a language I no longer understood. My job as a mechanic in Denver, once a source of routine, had started to feel meaningless. I'd fixed cars and trucks for years, my hands getting used to the feel of engines and the hum of power tools. But nothing had the same weight now. Nothing felt as important as it once did. One day, as I walked out of the shop and into the early afternoon sun, I ran into Matt, an old buddy from high school who worked as a guide for outdoor trips. He had always been one of those guys who couldn't sit still, who spent more time on the trail than at home. We'd lost touch over the years, but I'd always considered him a friend. "Jake," Matt called out, chalking up to me with a grin that was equal parts friendly and infectious. "How's it going, man?" I forced a smile, but it felt thin, like a mask I couldn't quite pull off. "Tima is going. You know, just getting by." "Yeah, I hear you." Matt clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes scanning me with the kind of concern that friends give when they can tell something's not right. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." I shrugged, not sure how to explain. I hadn't really talked to anyone about the bear, not in detail. I'd given a few interviews to local reporters, mostly to answer questions and get the story off my back. But what could I say? That I was still rattled? That every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the sound of its claws scraping the ground? That I sometimes woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, my heart racing? "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't. "Just a lot on my mind, I guess." "Nuck, I did it," Matt said, his voice softening. "I heard what happened out there. That's no joke, man. But you know, there's this trip I'm leading this weekend. Just a short weekend hike through the foothills, nothing crazy. Thought it might be good for you to get out of the city. Clear your hand." A trip? I wasn't sure I was ready to go back out there. But at the same time, the idea of staying in the city, alone with my thoughts, didn't sound any better. Maybe it was time to face it. Maybe it was time to stop letting the bear control me. And maybe, just maybe, Matt's trip could be the start of that. "I don't know, Matt," I said, hesitating. "It's been tough, you know? I don't know if I'm ready to get back out there." "You don't have to be ready," Matt said with a half smile. "Sometimes you just gotta get out there and let nature do its thing. No pressure. Just a couple of days to breathe, away from all the noise." I hesitated, but only for a second. I could feel the old pull of the outdoors, the lure of the quiet solitude of the wilderness. It was a part of me that had never really left, even after everything. And as much as I feared it, I needed to go back. "All right," I said, finally nodding. "I'll do it." The morning of the trip was cloudy, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. I packed light, just the essentials, though I couldn't help but feel like I was forgetting something. But that was the thing with hiking. It was about the bare minimum, about survival, about what you really needed. I was trying to tell myself that this trip was just that. A chance to reset, to get my head on straight. It wasn't about confronting my fears. It was just about getting away. Matt and I met up at the trailhead, and we were joined by a few others. A group of hikers, experienced enough to know what they were doing but not overly seasoned. I felt like an outsider among them. A stranger on a path I wasn't sure I could walk anymore. The other hikers were talking excitedly about their trips, their plans, their gear, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to that moment by the river. The sudden crash of the bear's body into mine, the flash of its eyes. Ready to hit the trail, Jake? Matt asked, his voice cutting through my thoughts. I nodded, trying to push the unease away. Yeah, let's do it. We started off slowly, winding our way up through the woods. The air was cool and damp, the smell of pine and earth filling my lungs. The trail was muddy, slick in places, but it felt good to be back out in nature, even if it was hard to shake the weight of the past. Around noon, we stopped for a quick break, huddling under a small overhang as the sky opened up. Ting rain poured down in steady sheets. Everyone set up their gear, unpacking snacks and water. Matt seemed to be in his element, effortlessly chatting with the group, making jokes, and making sure everyone was okay. But I couldn't keep up with the conversation. My mind was a million miles away. I looked out at the forest, watching the rain run down the trees. Something felt off. It wasn't a bear, at least I didn't think it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. You okay, Jake? Matt's voice brought me back to reality. I turned to face him. Yeah, just zoning out. You sure? You're looking like you saw a ghost again, he said, his tone a little more serious now. I nodded, trying to smile. I'm fine, just trying to clear my head. The rain didn't let up, and after about an hour, we packed up and continued on our way. The trail started to get steeper, winding higher into the foothills. My legs burned, and I could feel the old rhythm of hiking coming back to me. But there was still a part of me, in deep part, that remained tense. Every snap of a twig, every rustling of the underbrush, made my heart jump in my chest. It wasn't until we reached the ridge that I felt it. The unmistakable stillness of the forest. The sudden quiet that seemed to fall over everything, like nature had just stopped breathing. I stopped in my tracks. The others were a few steps ahead, oblivious, but I couldn't move. Matt, I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. Do you hear that? Matt turned, confused. Hear what? The silence, I said, glancing around. It's too quiet. He frowned, and his eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. You sure? The rain's probably messing with the sound. No, I insisted, my pulse quickening. It's not just the rain. There's something wrong. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a chill spreading down my spine, and then there it was, the unmistakable snap of a branch, a sound that only a heavy animal could make. Matt's face went pale. What is that? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The bear was out there, somewhere in the woods, watching us. And for the first time since the attack, I realized I might not be ready to face it after all. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. It had been almost 2 months since the bear attack. For the first time in a long while, I was standing at the edge of the woods again, looking at the mountains with a feeling of hesitation that was as familiar as the air itself. Matt and I had planned a weekend trip into the foothills. Nothing too crazy, just a few days to clear our heads, to find some distance from the noise of the world. But for me, this wasn't just a getaway. It was a confrontation, a chance to face the memory of what had happened and, in some small way, reclaim the peace that I had once found in these mountains. The trailhead was quieter than I remembered, the usual hum of nature subdued by a morning mist that clung to the trees. As Matt and I got our gear together, the rest of the group drifted in. There were 6 of us in total, all seasoned enough to be comfortable in the wilderness but not overly enthusiastic about what lay ahead. One of the guys, True, was already talking about the best spots for fishing, as if that would be the thing that made the trip worthwhile. The other two were a couple, Sam and Lila, in their late 20s, both fit and eager, with a lot of energy but little understanding of the kind of stillness I was craving. Matt gave me a sideways glance as I adjusted the straps on my pack. "You good?" he asked, his voice casual, but I could hear the concern behind it. "Yeah," I said, nodding, though my stomach was in knots. "Just taking it all in." "Knock," she added, his tone softening. "There's no pressure. You don't have to push yourself. If you want to bail at any point, we can turn back. Just remember why you're out here. It's for you, not anyone else." I appreciated that more than I could say, but at the same time, I didn't want to back out. I needed to face it, even if it meant confronting the deepest part of my own fear. We started up the trail, the mist swirling around us like some kind of veil, hiding the landscape and muffling the sounds of the world. The first few steps were easy enough, the forest thick and green, the air cool and fresh, smelling of pine and damp earth. There was a rhythm to the walk, something soothing in the repetition of our steps. But as we moved deeper into the woods, I began to feel it. The tension, the anticipation that something was waiting just beyond the treeline. As we hiked, the conversation ebbed and flowed, the other hikers chattering about their lives, about their plans, but I found myself slipping into silence. The trees around me seemed to close in, each one a reminder of that day in the Rockies. The ground felt unstable beneath my boots, like the earth itself could suddenly give way and swallow me whole. I had to shake the thought away. "'Kay, Matt," I said, forcing myself to break the silence. "You remember that spot you mentioned? The one by the creek?" Matt glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Yeah, I remember. We'll be there in a couple of hours. It's a great spot for fishing. Nice and quiet." I nodded, not really hearing him. The fog had started to thicken, and with it, the air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. It wasn't like before. Before, the wilderness had felt alive, vibrant. But now it felt like a place of silence, of waiting, as if something was just on the edge of my vision, lurking. We hiked on in silence for a while, the only sounds being our boots crunching through the underbrush and the occasional call of a bird. The forest was dense here, with thick pines and ferns growing wild, their roots twisting like veins beneath the surface. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel heavy, as though the world itself was pressing in on me. Eventually, we came to a clearing, where the trees opened up to reveal a small creek running through the center of the forest. The water was clear and fast-moving, cutting through the rocks in a series of smooth curves and eddies. The spot Matt had mentioned was just ahead, a shallow pool with smooth stones lining the edge. It looked peaceful, almost serene, but to me it felt like a trap, a place where everything could change in an instant. Matt walked ahead, dropping his pack and setting up his fishing rod with ease. "This place is perfect," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Why don't you cast out a line, man? Clear your hand." I watched him for a moment before sitting down by the edge of the creek, the water rushing past me in a low murmur. The others were getting settled around the area, talking in low voices, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't the same place it had been before. This wasn't the peaceful spot I had once visited. I reached into my pack and pulled out my rod, slowly assembling it, though my hands weren't steady. I tried to focus on the task, the way the line unfurled as I cast it into the creek. The water took it, and for a moment, I was able to forget the way my heart was pounding in my chest. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the creek, the birds overhead, the faint rustling of the trees. But then I heard it, the crack. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It wasn't the usual sound of wind or the creaking of branches. It was something heavier, something that shouldn't have been there. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees across the creek, but saw nothing. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice tight with unease. Matt glanced up from his rod, his expression unreadable. What? He asked, as if he hadn't heard anything. That sound, I repeated, a tremor in my voice, like something's breaking through the trees. Matt frowned but shrugged. It's probably just an elk or something. Don't worry about it. But I wasn't so sure. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end, and my gut was screaming that something wasn't right. I stood up slowly, trying not to draw attention to myself, scanning the trees. There was no movement, but the air felt thicker now, like it was charged with something dangerous. Matt, I said again, my voice lower this time. You sure it's just an elk? He looked over at me, his brow furrowed. Jake, relax, all right? You're spooking yourself. It's nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it. The quiet wasn't natural. Something was wrong. I took a step back, away from the creek, my heart hammering. That's when I heard it again, closer this time. The unmistakable sound of branches snapping under the weight of something huge. Something heavy. I turned to Matt, my voice coming out in a rush. Matt, we need to leave. Right now. He stood up at that, finally noticing the panic in my voice. What the hell's going on? He asked, his tone sharp now. I didn't answer. I just turned and started moving, grabbing my gear and slinging it over my shoulder. The others were still talking by the creek, unaware, but I couldn't stay here another second. Jake, wait. Matt called out behind me, but I didn't stop. I pushed through the brush, my heart pounding as I made my way toward the trail. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run, to get as far away as I could. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see nothing, but then I heard it. The deep, guttural growl that sent ice into my veins. I stopped in my tracks, and then I saw it, the bear. It emerged from the trees, its massive form lumbering into the clearing like a nightmare made flesh. Its eyes locked on me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It was the same one, the one from before. The scars, the size, everything was the same, and this time it was much, much closer.